So now it's my honor to introduce our first featured poet, Lynn Davidson, like I said, all the way from New Zealand. And I'll grab my notes to give a proper introduction. So Lynn Davidson's memoir, Do You Still Have Time for Chaos, will be published by Te Herenga Waka University Press in Wellington in 2024. Her latest poetry collection, Islander, was published by Sherman's Books in the UK and Te Herenga Waka University Press in 2019. Lynn is a member of 12, a collective of women writers who, incidentally, will be performing at the Edinburgh International Book Festival this year. Lynn had a Hawthornden Fellowship in 2013 and a Bothy Project Residency in 2016. She won the Poetry New Zealand Poetry Award in 2020 and was the 2021 Randall Cottage Creative New Zealand Writer in Residence. In July, she takes up the Mike Riddle Writing Residency in the extraordinary landscape of Uterehua, I hope I pronounced that all right, in central Otago in Aotearoa, New Zealand's South Island. Lynn's work has been published widely, including in the Poetry Review, PN Review, New Writing Scotland, Cordite, Text, Sport, Landfall, Verb, and the Best of Best New Zealand Poems. Lynn is a creative writing teacher, and she calls New Zealand and Scotland home. And Lynn, I don't know if you know, but we have a little ritual or tradition over here at Poetry Lit, where after the introduction, I do a little reflection, having read a little bit of the work of the featured poet. And so I read your poems and I found this a poetry of great diversity in subject matter, from a work of art to poetry and language to being about countries or flowers, but also a great diversity in form and style. And especially in work with such variety, I find it very interesting to look for patterns and hidden patterns. Nature and country, and especially Scotland and New Zealand as your home countries, are remarkable presences here. But so is language, and often it appears to be connected with nature. In the poem To Get Here, for instance, a mention of tadpoles turns into your vowels at my table, in my mouth. And in another poem, it says, I have left Scotland, the word, the place. It's an interesting line of imagery, and I call it imagery to discern it from a line of thought. So an interesting line of imagery to explore how words make place and place words. And or how language, breath, and eating are connected in this work. And that is only one of the strands pulling at you in these poems. The imagery itself is quite another. The day folds its light like linen is an exquisite example, I think. And then there's context. For instance, the poem Head of a Young Woman, after a work by Alison Watt, immediately reminded me of Rilke's archaic Torso of Apollo, and thus was in conversation with it. So these are poems with a lot going on, within the lines, through the lines, and long after the lines have been read. And another tradition is the question I always ask before the reading starts. And because June is Poetry Month in the Netherlands, basically, with the Poetry International Festival coming up in just 1 week. So Lynn, I would love to know who your poetic hero is and why.
Wow, thank you, Mila, and thank you for such great reading of my poems. It's really lovely to be here. So, a poetry hero, there are many, but one is Kathleen Jamie, who's probably needs, you probably all know, Scottish poet. She writes really beautiful, resonant poems that look really closely at the natural world. And at first glance, they seem, to have a real simplicity and clarity, but the closer you look, they get more sort of complex and multi-layered. She writes about loss, ecological loss, but she never really takes her eye off beauty. And I think it's important to keep paying attention to beauty. And Jamie feels like a good poet to be reading at this point in history. But beyond all of that, she's worth reading because she's just a very fine poet. So she's a quiet and observant poetry hero for me for these turbulent times.
Wow, interesting. And also this combination of loss and beauty.
Yeah, Well, I think we've got to hold on to, I just think there's a lesson in being still and listening out and being attentive. Maybe we're not so likely to go around destroying things if we're noticing what's there.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. And we are ready to notice and to listen to you.
Thank you. So the first poem I'm going to read is the poem that I was commissioned to write for an anthology of poems that respond to collections in the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow, and which will come out later this year. So I chose to respond, as you pointed out, Mila, I chose to respond to a painting by the Scottish artist Alison Watt. Head of a young woman. How does the face move and yet hold still? Thoughts seem to lift into it like birds, and her inward-looking eyes, so worked, follow those thought birds across fields and towns, coming and going from their winter home, glossy drape of mudflat and river mouth, the webbed print for shallow water swallows. Late afternoon sun, bare as a neck, illuminates the room. The young head achieves its form, and through it, the old forms rise as they do. Outside the window, some creature barks or coughs, and the day folds its light like linen. There is a pouring down of dusk, in which I imagine she goes, leaves the portrait room, the young woman, her coat, an exchange, a smile, a rearrangement. In the sweet present, her body turns like a river, her eyes suddenly looking for the usual things, a bus, a friend, her flat, a window, its catch, the evening coming in. So I lived in Edinburgh for several years. My grandparents were Scottish from Aberdeen, and I have many generations of ancestral bones in Scotland's soil. So I feel a sense of belonging to both Scotland and Aotearoa, New Zealand. And this is a poem about that kind of sense of belonging to two places. To get here, I drove through the Kaimanawas, which is the old forest, survivor of brutal winters, or the wild horses streaming over tussock, or the mountain range, and which translates as treasure, or eat the wild, or heart eater, or breath eater, which are the slippages of poetry. Impossible to know if I'm there, and I'm not there until suddenly I am, making small revisions to home like rivers do with their movement. It's a cold morning and the earth is black with sulfur yellow vents blowing hot steam, and I walk into high mist, Aotearoa, Scotland, this and here. The infield, tadpoles in the concrete trough, your vows at my table, in my mouth. I have been participating in the word Scotland. We have been moving through each other like fish and light and water through water. Sitting cross-legged beside my Scottish grandfather in the Tinnacorry Hills above Wellington City, where his son, my father, is playing accordion for the Polish club. He has been practicing the minor chords all day. We are waiting for him to finish. We are waiting to go home. My granddad, my nana, my sisters, my brother, and my mother, in our stolen wealth country that is regularly left off maps, which made my father happy. He'd never been to Scotland and never wanted to go back. which made my mother lonely for a country her mother never went to but called home. Like my father, my old friend from the battleground, I'm happy to be from unacknowledged country. Let's hold our pain invisible against our chest. Let's hold our parents' pain there too. It's just another lump of dirt, he'd say, but here I am, and here it is, and the ragged comforts of form and beauty still hold. I drove through the Kaimanawas to get here, to dip my hand in the icy water of the trough, wanting the bunched, slippery orbs of becoming to brush my fingers, to hear their plip, plip sounds, those little flicker in water sounds that translate as heart eater or breath eater or eat the wild, which are the slippages of wild vows at my table, of poetry in my mouth. Thanks. I lived for a long time in Pukerua Bay, which is a small, rugged little west coast beach just north of Wellington. And here's a poem that springs from that place. How to live by the sea. Be like the terns crouched on the shore, still under an empty sky. Stake your life on warnings. The gulls will circle, shrieking before rain. Keep one craft at hand, a kayak out back among nasturtiums. Walk lightly, the grey heron will haunt your letterbox. Cultivate patience, the orca may pass by here again. Settle for disorder. All summer you will swim before you wake. And thank you. My last two poems were written on coming back to New Zealand in September 2020 after 8 months pretty much on my own in my Edinburgh flat during COVID. I was so relieved to be heading back to New Zealand, not least for our very good Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. But I was very sorry to leave Scotland. So I left with really mixed feelings. And when I got back to Wellington, I was quite amazed that life at that point was going on pretty much as usual. So this poem is called Wellington Peonies, December 2020. There are gushy peonies outside the florist's door. Don't you just want to push your face into them, the florist says, which is a kindness because I am already pushing my face into them. So petaled, so inhabited, so pink, and bunched together in a zinc bucket like something cheaper, less luscious, more ordinary. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself, netted by light and breathing rivery London air. Oh, to blossom into invisibility, to walk through the uncanny narrow glade between buildings, that sudden temperature drop. To see people in long coats at the bus stop undulate in late spring wind like kelp forests. Bliss. Catherine Mansfield has Bertha arrange green and purple grapes on a long glossy table. Bertha is in a sudden ecstasy for a life she is about to lose. Of course, she doesn't know it yet. She thinks only that the purple grapes bring the carpet up to the table. And this is my last poem. It's called From Scotland to New Zealand. I sit on the shore, recovering from this long breath-held dive to get here. The shudder of relief to breathe in air. Such air in this place, The river of wind between these islands lands here and here and here. Less breathing in material, less breathing in material. How to measure land loss against the gentle constant of breath. I have left Scotland, the word, the place, the way we move through each other like light through water. Infrastructure will not solve distance, nor can you build a country inside another country. However, a word that sounds like a river of wind between islands. However, the word bridge, its excavating consonants, its failing reach, sits deep in the gullies of my mouth. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for this marvelous reading.